Good morning, everyone. Jonathan, if you don't mind, I'll kick us off.
She's worried about us.
Just a bit of a control freak over here.
We have no moderator, and so it's Pallavi's job to interview people, and she's really worried that I'm going to ask her a question that she's going to be floored by.
I prefer asking questions, as any good journalist should. But Jonathan, you know, I think what struck me most when I heard that I'd be doing this panel with you and researched your background was just how many books you've written. There's certainly more books than there are letters in the alphabet. It gave me vertigo, sort of reading the list of the titles that you seem to produce, sort of spit out almost every year. You had 3 books out in 2013, Modern China, An Armchair Traveler's History of the Silk Road, and a book on anime. You had 3 books out in 2010, A Brief History of the Samurai, Admiral Togo, and A Brief History of Kublai Khan. You have 1 or 2 titles out in just about every other year of the century so far, and I believe 2 in the pipeline, 1 on Beijing and 1 on Tokyo. So, I mean, what immediately struck me was wanting to ask you what it is that you eat, or perhaps what is it that you smoke that enables you to come up with this kind of output?
I eat Chinese food all the time. In fact, I once travelled around the world only staying in Chinatowns all the way. So I went from Yokohama in Japan to Shanghai, to Melbourne, to Sydney, to Honolulu, to San Francisco, Vancouver, New York, and then back to London. And I only ate Chinese food, and I only went to Chinatown in all those countries.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The secret to becoming a prolific writer is obviously Chinese
monosodium glutamate.
Yes, MSG all the way.
But you know, publishers, I don't know how it works in India, but in the UK and in Europe and America, there's only really 2 seasons for publishing books. Because if there's 150 books published every day, you want to be published just before Christmas or just before the summer holidays, because that's when most of the book buying is done. So I can write a book, I wrote a book 7 years ago, and it didn't appear until sort of just before the summer holidays last year. So you kind of get this, you seem to do nothing for a year or so, and then suddenly 3 books come out at once. So I'm not sitting.
Well, that would work if you only publish 3 books once in a while, but it's 3 books every year.
We're just being mathematically difficult now.
Well, so I'll try to be less difficult and ask you a more conventional question and sort of return to the beginnings in some way and ask you what it was that really drew you to Asia.
I decided when I was 9 years old that I wanted to be a writer. And my mother said, well, obviously you have to study English. And I said, no, I already speak English. I want to do something really weird so that I have something to offer, so that people will offer me, books to write. And so I chose Chinese and Japanese because I thought that's going to help me. And it did, because every year there's a new publisher coming up with a new list, and they will say, well, we need someone to cover China in our modern history of wherever. We need someone to cover Japan. So I kind of sneaked in that way.
So was it just because it was weird?
I grew up in a Chinese restaurant. My father played in a band in a Chinese.
So I see the Chinese restaurant, Chinese food is a theme, yeah.
I thought my mother was 3 Chinese waitresses for the first 3 years of my life, because this kind of triple goddess followed me around everywhere. And so I had this real affinity for China. China for me feels like home. It's very odd for me to be in India, where I know nothing about the history or the culture or the people, because I genuinely am a foreigner here.
So 3 more books next year on India, History of Mumbai, History of Times of India.
No, because I feel that if you're an author, it's your job to know more than some idiot who's just got off a plane. In India, I'm an idiot who's just got off a plane. In China, I speak the language, I understand the people, and so I have something to say, I think. I mean, what motivated you to choose first China and then Indonesia and then Japan? What was it that sent you there?
Yeah, that's interesting, Jonathan, because, I grew up in India, and although we share a 4,000-kilometer long border with China, it was pretty much a blank space in my mental map of the world. I went to school and university in India in the 1980s, early 1990s, and it was entirely possible to go through the education system here without knowing anything about China beyond the fact that we had a border skirmish in 1962. That was the only salient feature I really remember studying. And we were very sort of Western oriented in our education. We studied in English. I went on to study in the UK and then in the US. And the East was, really quite inscrutable. It was not even particularly attractive in any way culturally to me, I would say, growing up. So there was this sort of China-shaped gap in the way in which I saw the world. Very ironic, considering that it then became this sort of seminal part of my identity going forward. So how did I come to China? It was an accident, and like many good stories, it involved a romance. I went to London to do my master's degree, and while there I met a Spaniard who is now my husband, who was then my boyfriend, who was a sinologist and had studied Chinese and Japanese in university. And after our year in London together, he moved to Beijing. I went on to LA. This was 2000, so we're talking about 16 years ago. And he persuaded me to come to Beijing for a few months. And he said, just come out here and, see what you think. I was very skeptical about the whole idea, but I went along. And I remember from virtually the word go, sort of driving into the city of Beijing from the airport, being so energized by what I saw, the dynamism of the place, the fact that buildings were virtually being spat out, vomited up, as it were, along the highway. The entire city was being kind of rebuilt, and there was a huge amount of optimism and a sense that something big was going on, that there was some kind of epochal shift, that this was where history was being made. And I remember very clearly having a feeling that this was something that, I would tell my grandchildren about. I would kind of tell them that I was there when. So I was overwhelmed by the fact that there was this seismic phenomenon that I'd just been sort of unaware of, because back in 2000 you could still to some extent be unaware of China, something that's not at all possible today. I just got hooked. I got sucked in and convinced that this was hugely important. And one of the things that was very interesting about it for me was that the learning curve was very steep because I hadn't grown up with any context. So there was no sense of sort of deja vu. Going as an Indian, as a sort of Western-oriented urban Indian, going to a European city, going to America, felt weirdly familiar. Even if you'd never been there, you'd seen it in movies. It just felt there was too much resonance in some ways. Whereas with China, everything was sort of fascinating, and at the same time, I was surprised to find how it was not inscrutable at all, and how there were these deep sort of civilizational connects with India, and how much resonance there actually was, despite the fact that if you had asked me as a youngster in the 1990s, I would probably have said it was one of the most alien cultures I could have imagined.
You mentioned going into Beijing the first time. I remember the first time I went into Beijing, I was in a taxi, and it was what I thought was a foggy day. But it was really foggy. It was so foggy that the buildings appeared to kind of render out of the mist towards me, like I was in some kind of
Can you tell me what year you were talking about?
The first time I went to Beijing was 2006. When I was a student, I was actually a student in the year of Tiananmen Square, so none of the students even could go to mainland China. So I studied in Taiwan, which is a Chinese-speaking country, but not a communist country. So the first time I went to Beijing was 2006, and the smog was an issue. And you've written an entire book about the smog in Beijing. I wondered what led you to do that?
Well, because Delhi at the moment is suffering from some of the worst pollution that has been seen anywhere in the history of pollution in the world.
Do you think Delhi is actually worse than Beijing?
So currently Delhi is definitely worse than Beijing. If you look at the WHO lists of most polluted cities around the world, I think something like 25 cities, Indian cities appear in the top 50. Delhi was number 10, but number 1 in 2014. It's actually improved and is on number 10 in the last list. Beijing was number 56. So there's no comparisons. So while Beijing continues in the international imagination to kind of be the poster boy for pollution, in fact, the pollution in India is far more severe, and we're doing far less about it. So, I think it's quite interesting how it's been covered by the international media. And it was always very puzzling to me because living in Beijing, there was so much obsession about pollution. I remember particularly in the run-up to the Olympic Games, there was more written about the pollution than there was about the athletes. It was very much the sort of dominating narrative when it came to the international media. And at the same, 2 years later, we had the Commonwealth Games in Delhi, and there was almost no coverage of the pollution in the international media. People talked about safety of women, people talked about corruption, there were various issues that were brought up, but pollution was not one of them. And it's something that's always puzzled me, this kind of discrepancy in how they've been seen. And to some extent, I think it's because India has cut a lot of slack for being a democracy. And there's a sense that we have this sort of same shared value system, and that, when you have a democratic, form of government, then there are so many things that the government has to deal with. Whereas China is this authoritarian government that, people are worried about at multiple levels, the rise of China. I actually think it got skewered for pollution in a way. There was almost a sense of Schadenfreude or Ehrenfreude, because there was a sense that China's doing so well at so many levels, but there's the pollution. So yeah.
Well, I remember how the pollution story unfolded in China because initially, in your book Smoke and Mirrors, you talk about the SARS epidemic and how everyone pretended it wasn't happening. And it was very much the same thing with pollution in Beijing. Firstly, it was a foreign issue. Only foreign press were reporting it. Anyone who brought up the subject was an idiot who was obviously subjected to the foreign media. And the foreign residents in Beijing were the first people to wear masks. They were walking around wearing these, actually I still have mine with me from Beijing, I should have worn it in Delhi. And the Chinese would laugh at them for overreacting. And then I was reading in your book today, though, that you said that the Chinese started wearing masks because of the SARS epidemic. And now in Beijing, you can buy a face mask in every single convenience store, and you see people wearing them all the time.
I remember, Jonathan, around 6 years ago going to Beijing, and they have this popular magazine, sort of the equivalent of Time Out, that used to tell you about the top 5 spas to visit or the top 5 French restaurants, and the cover feature was on the top 5 pollution masks. So yes.
But did you have any difficulty in China or India reporting something that was being suppressed, like SARS?
Well, SARS, yes. I mean, so SARS, there was a lot of denial around it. And in my book, I actually do a sort of, in Smoke and Mirrors, the first book, I actually kind of look at it almost day to day as the information began to come out. And it was very interesting because for around 3 weeks, it was projected as something that was essentially confined to Hong Kong and southern China and was not an issue in the capital, Beijing. And we were told that Beijing had perhaps 10 or 12 cases. And then I think it was towards the end of April that they came out and said, well, actually there's 800 cases. And then the next day they said that there were 3,000 cases. And when that happened, there was a complete breakdown in trust with government, which was very interesting. I was teaching at a university at the time, and most young people had a very strong degree of trust in the government, and hence, when foreign media were reporting on SARS, there was this sense that, it was very overblown. The foreign media always victimize us. Pallavi, don't believe what you read in the foreign media, trust in the government. And then the moment the government kind of came up with this, it was the opposite reaction of complete panic and a huge breakdown in trust. So yeah, I mean, SARS was interesting times. I hadn't really begun reporting. I was teaching that year, although SARS was what led me to journalism. My very first few pieces were about SARS. Pollution has, in subsequent years, become something that is quite open to write about in China. Environmental concerns in the last 5 or 6 years, I would say, are one area where there is quite a lot of leeway in reporting on. And I think that the authorities themselves have realized that they have a stake both for, just China's, for making sure that China's growth continues, and also in terms of political survival, to invest in the environment. And in fact, we're increasingly seeing prospects of China surprisingly and unexpectedly emerging as the kind of leader on environmental issues when you see Donald Trump in America, who's been very skeptical of climate change and so on. So I think pollution and environmental issues were actually one area which were reasonably easy to write about. In India, there's been no suppression. There was just no data available. So, for example, until last year, we didn't even have source apportionment studies. What that means is we didn't have serious scientific studies that told you where the pollution is coming from. How much of it, comes from vehicular sources? How much of it comes from industrial sources, from construction dust, from other kinds of biomass burning? And, so you don't even know what you're talking about. There's almost no pollution gathering mechanisms. We only have something like, 39 pollution gathering stations across the entire country of India, compared to thousands in China. So it was really the lack of data that was a problem.
So let me ask you about journalism, writing about China, not just as a journalist, but also you've written the Lonely Planet Guide to, is it to Beijing?
To China.
To China. You've written the Lonely Planet Guide to China for the Indian market. What is it that the Indian market needs to know about China that the Lonely Planet Guide for other countries doesn't have?
Shopping and eating. The Lonely Planet Guide sort of evolved as a guide that was meant for the off-the-beaten-track solo traveler from Western countries, the backpacker, the quintessential backpacker. This is not the Indian traveler. The Indian traveler wants safe. The Indian traveler tends to travel with families and in package groups. And when they go to China, they don't want to do weird things. They seek the comfort of the familiar. So in many ways, they actually wanted a guide to where they can eat vegetarian food, where can they buy cheap knockoff products, because Indians are big into kind of going to China to shop cheaply and come back with all kinds of electronics and so on. So it was really funny because it was the complete opposite of the original kind of mission of The Lonely Planet. So there was some of that, and then there was also, they wanted me to write some essays that drew out some of the historical and civilizational connections between India and China specifically, of which there are so many. I mean, in Henan province, for example, in a city called Luoyang, you have this beautiful temple called Baima Se, which almost never gets written about. But this is the White Horse Temple, which was built in AD 68, if I'm not mistaken, to house, it was the very first Buddhist temple ever built in China. And it was built to house 2 Indian monks. I wrote about the Shaolin Temple, which people write about, but I focused specifically on the Indian connections. The fact that, once again, it was founded by an Indian monk called Bada, or Batuo in Chinese, and the fact that the Shaolin style of Kung Fu was developed by another Indian monk called Bodhidharma. So there are so many connections, and you wouldn't actually read about them in, say, the typical Lonely Planet guide.
I love it that you describe the Baima Se, the White Horse Temple.
Do you know it, Jonathan?
Yeah, I've been there. I've been to Luoyang. I wrote a book about the history of martial arts, and I went to Luoyang.
Oh, how fabulous!
To go to the Shaolin Temple, because my wife does the Japanese version of Shaolin Kung Fu, so she wanted to go there and fight people. It's a story.
Did she fight you, Jonathan?
I have, on occasion, been beaten up by my wife by accident. By accident.
He's a brave man. Yeah.
It's her whole family are martial artists, so they're always trying out new finger locks and stopping each other's hearts for fun and then starting them again. It's very dangerous. Anyway, the Baima Se, the Chinese tourist guides and the Chinese history books all describe it as the first Buddhist temple in China. And it's in Luoyang, which is in central China. It's right in the middle. And I love it because it's not the first Buddhist temple in China by any means. It's the first Buddhist temple in central China.
Central China.
As we both know, Indian culture took hundreds of years to drift in up the Kunjarab Pass and
Xinjiang.
through Xinjiang. For those of you that don't know, the Taklamakan Desert, which is an impassable desert, it used to be possible to sail across it from south to north. You could, up until 1905, when the rivers dried up, you could get in a boat at Khotan, and you could sail right into the middle of the desert. And then you could pick up your boat, carry it a couple of miles, and get into another river, which would take you to the northern side. And so, for most of the what I would call the Dark Ages, for 400, 500, 600 AD, there were Indian communities dotted right the way along the top of the Taklamakan Desert. And it was a very Buddhist civilization, it was a very Indian civilization, which was entirely wiped out in the Middle Ages.
Sorry to nitpick, but wasn't Bimasa AD 68, so a lot earlier than that? You're saying AD 400, 500, 600?
Yeah, the Bimasa was founded in 450.
AD? Oh, okay.
I think, yeah.
All right, go ahead.
So the thing is that when the Chinese rhetoric, which I'm not going to argue with, is that Xinjiang is part of China.
Yeah.
But it was a contested area for a very long
Yes.
time. There were times when it was part of Tibet. There were times when...
It's been part of an Indian empire, the Kushan Empire as
frankly,
well.
it was part of India for a while. And so there would have been Buddhist temples dotted all the way along from west to east. And it's only when the Bimasa temple is founded in China that they start talking about it's the first one. But that actually contradicts their own publicity about the Chinese...
being part
about
of
Xinjiang
China.
being part of China. Out of interest, by the way, the Silk Road is famous for silk being transported from east to west. Would anyone like to guess what commodity was most transported from west to east? I'm throwing this to the crowd, if anyone wants to put themselves on the spot, except Renuka Chatterjee, my publisher, who's read my book and knows. Yes? Was it chili?
Chilies.
No, chili did not arrive, and chili is an American product, so it didn't arrive until the 15th century, 15th, 16th century. What? No, not ice. There was a lot of salt that came from the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, and there were horses that came from Uzbekistan. But the product that was transported from the Mediterranean all the way to China in the greatest amount was coral. Because coral is red or blue coral from the Red Sea was a vital component in Buddhist statues.
Is this coal?
Coral.
Ah.
Coral. What? Yeah. So that was the commodity that was most transported in the opposite direction.
Wow.
There you go. It's a top fact.
Fascinating.
Impress your friends with that fact.
By the way, I must congratulate this audience on having come. We had massive competition with Kangana Rao and the ethical slut happening at the same time. So well done, guys.
Unless you've only come here because the other venues are full, in which case,
So, Jonathan, I've noticed, I think we've also talked a little bit in the pre-session about perspectives. And I remember asking you, but you didn't give me a full answer, so perhaps you could elaborate on that now. Because I've noticed that you, some of your books, blurbs, describe your books as having been written from the perspective of the cultures that you write about. So say about Japan, in the way that the Japanese see themselves, or about China in the way that the Chinese see themselves. But how do you do that? I mean, you're not Chinese, you're not Japanese, you're a Lawai, or you're a foreigner, a Vilayati, whatever, who's kind of coming in from outside. And so of necessity, your perspective is that of an outsider, and there's something valuable to that. So how do you, bring that perspective in?
When the blurb on a book for the popular audience says, I'm telling you this story from the point of view of the Chinese, from the point of view of the Japanese, it's a shorthand for saying, I'm not an idiot who's been parachuted in completely ignorant culture that I'm writing about. So in the case of Japan, for example, I'll give you an Indian example for Japan. The narrative of Japan in World War II is one of terrible atrocities and of attacking Pearl Harbor without declaring war, and the narrative of the war crime trials after 1945, which went on until 1956, by the way. It was 11 years of trials in different places. is one of stringing the Japanese up. What was not reported, and what was only of interest outside the white world, was that one of the judges in the war crime trials issued a dissenting statement, a 1,300-page dissenting statement. And he was an Indian
judge, Judge Pal.
Radha Binod Pal. I mean, has anyone here heard of Radha Binod Pal, out of interest?
I'm sure that nobody...
Yeah, excellent.
He's huge in Japan.
Huge in Japan. If you go to the Yasukuni Shrine...
There's a mural.
There's a mural celebrating Radha Binod Pal. And the Japanese have completely misread what he said. I mean, he said, I'm not contesting that they were fiends. I'm not contesting that the Bataan Death March was a war crime. What I'm contesting is victor's justice. What I'm contesting is the idea that you've invented a new crime of inciting...
Of the Class A criminals. And he said they were already indicted as war criminals, so what's the point of saying that, you know, they're extra special, horrible criminals?
Saying that if you want to call the people of Japan criminals because they attacked Nanjing, why are you not calling the people of Britain criminals for firebombing Dresden? Because you're arguing that the people had a duty to resist their own government in what they did. And so he was talking about what he called victor's justice, and he said that if you put Luxembourg under the kind of pressure, the kind of sanctions pressure that Japan was under, the kind of immigration pressure that Japan was under, if you put Luxembourg under that kind of pressure, it would have attacked America too. And so the Japanese absolutely love this as a kind
of vindication.
They see it as a vindication. It's not a vindication. If you read the entire document,
it's not. And the nationalists in Japan have used this.
Have used it. But the point is that is not a perspective that is known to the European world at all. They don't even know who Judge Pal is. And I find it to be... And what Judge Pal was ultimately saying is that capitalism and colonialism create these kind of pressures in Asia that the white world doesn't understand. And so when I wrote my history of modern Japan, I had a whole section on Judge Pal because I think he's a really interesting case. And his statement, which you can Google it, you can get the whole thing online for free as a PDF, but it was suppressed until the 1990s. I never heard of him. I've got 3 degrees in Asian subjects. I'd never heard of him. So I think that's a very interesting attitude to have when you talk about the Far East to a foreign audience. And I think it's my duty as an author to go that little bit further, to tell people stories that they're not expecting to hear.
So that's interesting, Jonathan. What you're saying is that you're basically putting across their points of view. You're sort of publicizing their points of view as well. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say that I read a lot of books about Asia because it's my job. And what I really can't stand is someone who advertises their ignorance. A foreigner who goes to another country and says, I know nothing about this, but I went to the pub and I met a taxi driver and we chatted about some stuff and now I'm an expert on China. I mean, I'll name names. Peter Fleming, who has this great reputation as being an author about the Silk Road, brags all the time about how little he knows and how he doesn't speak Chinese.
But on the other hand, Jonathan, sorry to jump in, I also despise pundits, and you have so many of them who, rather than saying we know nothing about China, say we know everything about China, when it's impossible to know everything about China. And so to some extent, I also quite like it if people profess a certain amount of ignorance, because they are ignorant. Everybody is ignorant. A Chinese person will also be ignorant about a lot about China. And so, you know, ignorance is part of being a journalist. And to kind of go into something being like, I know everything, will also lead you down the wrong path.
I'm not claiming in any way to know everything about China,
yeah.
But I would like, as a book buyer, I want to know that the person whose work I'm reading knows something about China. And you mentioned in Smoke and Mirrors about how surprised you are at how little the Chinese often know about their own culture. And let's not single the Chinese out for this. The British themselves think because they're British, they know everything about British history, and then it turns out they've never heard of the Opium Wars. And you think, well, hey, that's kind of weird. And this is something that I experience a lot with the Chinese themselves, is that it's often assumed among the Chinese that being Chinese makes you an expert on Chinese history. And then I'll blunder in and say something, and they realize all they know is the Twitter version. And when I talk about, for example, the Buddhist cities, the Indian Buddhist cities in the north of Xinjiang, they've never even heard of them.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about perspectives, if you don't mind, Jonathan. So in my style of writing, I kind of operationalize the fact that I am offering a perspective. So I'm not kind of telling you China as the Chinese see themselves. I'm not telling you about Japan as the Japanese see themselves, but essentially telling you about China as I see it. And I think it's quite important in many ways to make the I clear, because with a lot of journalism, there is no I, and then that becomes a kind of false objectivity. And almost all of us come to a situation with a certain amount of baggage. And that baggage is very important to how we interpret what we are seeing. We see through these sort of unconscious lenses. And, you know, I want to operationalize those lenses so that the reader is not just aware of what I'm talking about, but also aware that who I am and how I'm interpreting what I'm seeing. And this was something that, you know, it really struck me how important sort of the matter of perspective was, because I was quite an anomaly. I continue to be an anomaly because I am an Indian foreign correspondent, and foreign correspondents as a kind of profession are essentially Western foreign correspondents. There's very few foreign correspondents that come from other parts of the world. And so living in China with a bunch of colleagues who were basically Western journalists, and we were all reporting on similar themes, I was time and time again struck by how differently we saw things and how they would pathologize China and see various things as somehow peculiar to China because these were peculiar to them. These were not the norm.
Jazz, can we have some examples here?
I will give many examples if you like. I'll give 2 examples. I'll give you a very everyday example of, say, traffic in Beijing. You know, I'd be sort of sitting on a Friday shooting the breeze with colleagues in the Bookworm, which is a cafe in Beijing. And, you know, a standard sort of Western expat groan, which includes foreign correspondents, was about how terrible the traffic in Beijing was. And they would groan and moan about how, you know, the Chinese are so pig-headed in traffic jams and they can't follow rules and there's so much chaos, etc. And then I would go to the airport and pick up somebody from India, and virtually the first thing they would say as we were driving into the city, staring out of the window of the car, was, "Oh my God, the traffic is so orderly. You know, the Chinese follow all the rules. There's no overtaking from the left. You know, where's the chaos?" So you're seeing exactly the same phenomenon, and you are drawing diametrically opposite conclusions from it. We would look at public toilets, and people obsessively wrote about toilets at the time and how, you know, disgusting and stinky they were, and you know, this was an indictment of the government. Everything was always an indictment of the government when it was written by a Western foreign correspondent, say in the lead up to the Olympic Games, terrible toilets. And I remember the thing that struck me was the toilet cleaners and the fact that, you know, they mostly wore gloves when they were cleaning the toilets, and how this sort of single, simple article of protective clothing gave them a certain dignity that was missing in India. And this led me to a story about, God, I can't remember the name, about this model worker from the Communist Revolution who was a toilet cleaner, and how in Chinese primary schools, it was still compulsory reading to read about this great toilet cleaner. And, you know, so it's just a very different kind of story. We'd look at corruption, and, you know, often foreign correspondents from the West would be surprised at the corruption. I'd be surprised that there was any action taken on the corruption, even if it was scapegoating. So there was a huge difference in perspective, I'd say.
I have a toilet cleaner story of my own. My Beijing book, which is... Publishers keep delaying it. It's out next month, I think. But it begins with a statue that you can find on Wong Fujing. And Wong Fujing is the major shopping street in Beijing. And outside a department store, there is this big statue of this kind of laughing fat man. And I walked past it a lot of times. And I just assumed it was some kind of entrepreneur who built the department store. But it's not. It's the guy who ran the sweet counter. Because he was also a model worker in the revolution. And so they wrote a book about him, about how he could weigh a handful of sweets with his hands, and all the children in Beijing loved him. And he gets a statue to himself. And so when a lot of foreign writers write about Beijing, they talk about the big statues of Chairman Mao, and, you know, how they glorify these dictators in China. But actually, they will build a statue to the man who ran the sweet counter as well, which I think is very sweet. It's an old perspective on China, I know.
Fabulous. So, Jonathan, I've recently moved to Japan, and you're the guy I think that I can turn to for help because I'm trying to understand Japan better. I've only been there 4 months. So, what do you think is the sort of single greatest difference between the Chinese and the Japanese? Culturally, perhaps, yeah.
Well, culturally, and if there's any Chinese or Japanese people in the audience, please put your fingers in your ears right now. Culturally, there's no real difference as far as I can see. China, there's this...
That would get you into real trouble in
so
Japan.
Much trouble.
Yeah.
But speaking as a historian, so much of Japanese culture is derived from the Tang dynasty. That's why they don't have chairs, because chairs were invented in the Song dynasty. And so the way that Japanese pronounce their own use of Chinese, their interest, sumo, wrestling, so many things about Japanese culture are actually derived from Tang China. And there's this term in Chinese, the Moonlight Kingdoms. And that means Japan, Korea, Vietnam. They're countries that don't shine with their own light. They shine with the reflected light of the glory of China. What makes Japan different is not a cultural issue at the basic level. It's a geographical issue. It's space. Because 73% of Japan is national trust land. It's mountains, it's forests, it's uninhabitable. And throughout Japanese history, the people have been crowded into an incredibly small space. And so everything about the Japanese attitude to the world around them and the way that Chinese culture evolved in Japan to become something different has been defined by being in incredibly close proximity to one another. In China, there is always space. Until the last 100 years, when everyone started deliberately concentrating themselves in cities, the Chinese have had so much space to roam around in. The Japanese have never had that option, and that has defined so many aspects of their character. And that's me speaking as a historian, because...
So as just a lay person, not a historian who's lived in both, for me, I would say one of the biggest differences has been that, I find the Japanese passive-aggressive and the Chinese aggressive. So, that's one way of kind of putting it, I suppose. And, it's just that the Chinese are so sort of straightforward and upfront, and the Japanese, the opposite. Everything is so sort of wrapped up in politeness and form. And, if I were to go to China and say I'm from India, I get these reactions like, India, terrible country, very poor, hot, too many children, why do you not have, one-child policy? And then in Japan, you say that you're from India, and I would imagine that for the average Japanese, there cannot be greater culture shock than somewhere like India, but they would never say that, oh, beautiful, very nice, a lot of aso.
Yeah. There is also
very nice.
cultural reason for that. There's a cultural reason for that as well, which once again, I think for me has a historical basis. And that is 200 years from 1603 to 1858, Japan was a police state. And it was run by the samurai, and at least in theory, they had the power of life and death over anyone they ran into. And this has developed an incredible level of politeness in the Japanese. Because there is, when you have a class system or you have a caste system, it generates politesse and hypocrisy, these two things that immediately start to bubble up, because everyone is trying so hard to be nice to each other. Because in Japan, there will be physical consequences if you're not. Yeah. And even though it's been 100 years since that system came to an end, I still see vestiges of it in the Japanese language, in the way they interact with one another, and in the way that when they want to be aggressive, they will be passive-aggressive. Yeah. In Japanese, for example, there are various levels. One of the reasons I love the language is there are so many levels of politeness. And so, if you want to say "I love you" in Japanese, there are 1,194 ways of saying it. Because they have 2 words for love, and they have 17 words for I, and they have 13 words for you.
I'm currently learning Japanese, so as you can imagine, that's a fun project.
So if I were to say it to Pallavi, I could decide what level of I-ness I wanted to use, and what level of you-ness I wanted to use, and what kind of love I wanted to say. But the Japanese don't use any of those words. They don't use any of those. Despite the fact there are 1,194 ways of saying it, it's considered rude to say it to somebody. It's considered American and brash
and really obvious to tell somebody that. So instead, Japanese, if I'm a man and I want to say I love you to a Japanese woman, I say, I think of you from time to time.
Do you, Jonathan?
All the time, all the time.
Okay, no, I mean, sorry, there was something that you said that I wanted to pick up on, which was you were talking about caste in India and how I was very surprised to discover that there was a sort of caste system in Japan as well, and that you, in fact, had an untouchable caste in Japan that used to, like in India, deal with butchery and animal carcasses, which I thought was fascinating, and that there are vestiges of it that continue in the present, and that you still have people that sort of belong to this caste.
They used to be called the Eta, which is the non-people, and now they're called, there's a euphemism for them, which is the Burakumin, which is the village people, not YMCA village people, but the people in the
other kind.
And in Japanese, it's an insult to do this, because of saying you have 4 legs, you're an animal. That's like a real insult. But the thing about the Burakumin is that although there are still some of them around in Japan, many of them emigrated at the first chance they got. And so the Japanese communities in Hawaii and Brazil, for example, many of them are the untouchable stars. Sod this for a laugh. If I can leave, I'll go and work somewhere where no one's going to.
And Jonathan, I heard that many of them also became yakuza, underground criminals, because this was the one sort of profession that was open to them and gave them some amount of mobility, social mobility.
The thing about the
You had to
People
fax.
with 2,200 letters in their language have to use it.
Really? So you had to fax government offices in triplicate, and in Indonesia, on the other hand, you can just SMS usually and just show up. And often it's incredibly informal. You know, they'll often be like, yes, meet Minister Ali on the 3rd floor of the Ministry of Economics, and you land up, there's almost no security. So it's extremely sort of informal access. But, you know, more broadly speaking, ultimately, as a journalist, you're a journalist. I mean, you have to sort of be open, you have to be receptive, you have to be as agendaless as is possible, learn the language, learn the issues. And so, you know, there are sort of universal ways of operating as a journalist that work across contexts, and that doesn't change.
But according to much of the foreign press at the moment, Japan is becoming much more difficult to report in. Over the last couple of, I mean, you're arriving in Japan at a time when the attitude of the Japanese government towards the press is becoming increasingly restrictive. To the extent I've actually heard journalists saying it's easier to report on China now than it is to report on Japan. Have you experienced any?
Well, I haven't been reporting on Japan. I've been working on these 2 books since I've been over there. And I've done a few pieces, but they've been opinion pieces. So I haven't actually struggled with issues of access. I believe it's very corporatist, and that you have these press clubs in Japan, and that you're sort of fed information from the government, and it's sort of controlled through clubs that exist. But I haven't, you know, experienced it firsthand. I have sort of done a few man or woman on the street kind of interviews, and people have actually been quite open to talking. So yeah, I mean, but what I do want to say is that reporting in China is not always as difficult, I think, as is sometimes assumed, particularly in countries like India, where we are very proud of our free press. And often there's this sense that, you know, oh, but China is totally controlled and authoritarian. And in fact, it was possible within certain restrictions and with many caveats to be able to talk to a very wide variety of people and do a lot of interesting reportage, and that it was far more freewheeling than I think a lot of Indians in particular often assume it to be.
So hang on, what's this new book?
No, it was Choked and Babies and Bylines. I've just had 2 out this year. Unlike you, who does 3 with, you know, regularity and ease, Jonathan, this was a great feat for me.
So you're not working on a new book at the moment?
No, I'm going to probably do a book on Japan eventually, but I would say that that's 3 or 4 years down the line. Do you want to open it up for questions?
Yes, we have about 10 minutes left, so if there are any questions from the audience, such as when are you going to start talking about ethical sluttery, for example, now is a good time to ask them. No, in fact, no one's asking. It's not going to happen, Duncan. You're in the wrong room.
Hi. So do either of you have Chinese names, and what is the process to come up with those names, and what do they mean?
Yeah, my Chinese name is Ai Pei, and Okay, the process. So I first picked it when I was teaching at a university in Beijing, and I essentially got all my students, I had 200 students, to come up with names, Chinese names for me, and I picked one. I wanted one that was relatively short. Some had 3 characters, this one has 2 characters, Ai Pei. So the surname goes first. So if I was in China, I would be Iyer Pallavi. So the I comes from Iyer. It's the first syllable of my surname, of my family name. And Pei and Pallavi have the same meaning. Pallavi has 3 different meanings. One of them is a flower bud, the flower before, a new flower, a new shoot. And Pei has a similar meaning. So it's a and then plus there's the per sound of Pallavi and Pei. So, a combination of meaning, of sound, and also it was an easier, because it was only 2 characters, for me to remember how to write it.
I've had 3 Chinese names over the course of my life. When I first started learning Chinese, everyone in the class was given a Chinese name because you can't use foreign names in China. So I was Ke Li Wen, which was my Chinese teacher's attempt to say Clements. And so I was Ke Li Wen for a while, and I hated it. And so when I went to China, I decided that I would pick a name for myself. And as a writer, I would pick a 2-character name, because writers and artists in the Far East sometimes have 2-character names. So I chose Cun Zhang, which means village rectitude.
As you do.
Yeah, and actually Cun Zhang is my favorite Japanese swordsmith is a man called Muramasa, and when you say Muramasa in Chinese, it comes out as Cun Zhang, which the Chinese really hated because Cun is not a surname in China, so it's a stupid name to have, and only an idiot would choose it. So,
well, given some of the English names that Chinese people pick, I think you're totally entitled to your stupid Chinese name.
I was reading about Empress Wu because I was writing a book about her, and this led me to Hillary Clinton, who is called, there's a biography of Hillary Clinton in Chinese called Empress Wu in the White House. And Hillary Clinton's Chinese name is Xila Rui Kelin Dun. Because if you are an important figure, you don't get a Chinese name. They give you an actual name. So Trump is Trump. So, yeah, it's Trump, we say. So, I decided if Hillary Clinton didn't have a Chinese name, I wasn't going to have one either. And one of my books was published in Chinese, and they called me Chao Na Sen Ke Le Men Si. So, that's what I have on my business card now, is Chao Na Sen Ke Le Men Si, which no one can remember. So, when I've been filming with National Geographic.
That's the equivalent of being called Tirumalai Kundavakam Anandam Pillai Rangachari. Anyway.
So now I just shorten it to Chao Na-sen, which is so I'm known as Mr. Chow now. So Chao Na-sen, which is Chinese for Jonathan, has become Mr. Chow. So when I'm talking to Chinese people now, and I have to interview them, I say, my name is Chao Na-sen, which is what I've ended up with. But it's been a long and elaborate process that you probably wish you'd never got into at the beginning. Yeah.
Tend to use a lot of Western names, especially their first names, Peter Chong or Adrian Hu, things like that. But, the Japanese, the Western narrative is always to portray the Germans, the Nazis, especially during the Second World War, as evil. And Japanese atrocities are never highlighted, as they are maybe in a Korean film,
You mean in Japan? You mean the way the Japanese have the narrative of the Second World War? Or do you mean abroad?
Abroad, because for the Koreans, the Japanese were really evil, the way the Koreans were massacred and tortured hideously by the Japanese. Also the Australian prisoners of war.
I'm sorry, what is the question?
The question is, how is it that in the Western narrative, only the Germans are portrayed as really evil and not the Japanese? This is wartime, Second World War,
How is it that in the Western narrative, only the Germans are portrayed as evil and not the Japanese?
Well, the Japanese are totally portrayed as evil in the Western narrative. When I studied Japanese, my grandmother said, don't come home. She literally said, do not come, if you go to Japan, do not come back.
Ma'am, part of the reason I think also is that Germany was in Europe. So the atrocities actually happened in Europe, whereas the Japanese atrocities happened in Asia.
Yes,
so geographically, they're further away. And so the portrayal of Japanese atrocities is maybe stronger in China and Korea, who were actually the victims, rather than Germany.
But if there is a Hollywood film about the war in the Pacific, the Japanese will not be portrayed as nice people. I mean, in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and in Pearl Harbor, the clue's in the title with Pearl Harbor that it's not going to be very pro-Japanese. I think that the The only thing I can think of, there was that one recently about the prisoner of war who went and met his camp commandant afterwards. But even that was quite unflinching in its portrayal of the Japanese. When you're dealing with an audience of my grandparents' generation, you cannot not say it, because they will not brook any polite discussion or even-handed discussion of the Japanese. They will want to hear what they were subjected to. And in fact, there was a lot of complaints among the Commonwealth, particularly the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Canadians, after World War II, when the Americans did not put Hirohito on trial as a war criminal. MacArthur made a very controversial, but I think right decision not to try Hirohito as a war criminal, because it would have caused so much trouble after the war with a potential Japanese fifth column. And the Commonwealth countries whose soldiers have been subjected to the Bataan Death March, for example, who've been imprisoned Japanese prisoner of war camps, were very unhappy about it. But nevertheless, that was the decision that MacArthur made. And I mean, it's difficult to go into it in a short answer, but I think it was the right decision to make, because it would have created so much more difficulty running Japan after the war and rebuilding the Japanese economy if the figurehead of the nation had himself been executed afterwards.
Yeah. I think there's a question there.
I wanted to ask, China is growing at say 7-8%, and whereas Japan is not growing at all. So in your interaction and living over there, do you find something like, kind of overall atmosphere, like something,
Well, yeah, I mean, Japan is a very prosperous country. And it's certainly not, I mean, you've had 20 years of deflation, the bubble has burst and so on. But in many ways, it's in a kind of holding pattern. I don't sort of get the sense that it's nosediving. It's just not kind of taking off. It's in this holding pattern. Sorry.
You're referring to the lost decades, the Ushinawara Junen, which was originally 10 years and then became 20 years. And it's described often internationally as a depression, but actually it was more of a stagnation, and Japan still...
It's stagnation. But in China, it's, onwards and upwards. I mean, I haven't lived there since 2009, but certainly the years that I lived there, it was astonishing, the dynamism, and it was very physical. It was palpable. It was being built. So, I mean, you could actually see it being reconstructed in front of your eyes.
Yes, but also part of the Chinese growth spurt is caused by the Japanese relocating all of their industry to China. You have... manufacturing, for example, in Japan is in free fall because they've moved all of their operations to China. In fact, now they're moving them even further away. They're moving them to Vietnam and to Africa.
Well, and Indonesia, they want to diversify away from China. But yeah, if that answers your question. I think there was another one at the back. Yes, you.
There are two versions of Indian reaching out to Thailand, the Indonesia.
I'm really sorry, I can't hear properly. Could you speak up?
Okay. I have a problem. There are two versions of how Indians went out to the east, which is to Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia. One version is that it was they took Hinduism as an idea and went and did what they did, and it was all peaceful. The other version is that the Cholas and the Pallavas, when they went out, there was heinous crime, there was barbarism. There are two versions in history. What do you think is the right one?
Yeah,
I don't understand the question. What was it?
There's two versions of how Hinduism spread to Southeast Asia. One is that it was very peaceful and sort of ideas-based and civilizational, and the other is that it was violent with a lot of barbarism. And what in fact?
The simple answer is I don't know, because I haven't studied the spread of Hinduism. I can talk about the spread of Islam, which has a very contradictory narrative depending on who you ask.
He's talking specifically about Hinduism, right? About Indians. Well, I can tell you a little bit about how it's perceived in Indonesia. I've spent the last 4 years living in Indonesia. And I'm not a historian, so I haven't looked at it from a historical perspective. But in the contemporary Indonesia, it was not at all seen as a sort of violent takeover, extremely organic, in fact, very peaceful, and it's replete with references to Hindu princes, to pilgrims, and so on, who kind of came and lived in different parts and converted those areas to Hinduism and Buddhism. You then had certain conflicts between different Hindu Buddhist kingdoms in Indonesia and the islands of Java and Sumatra, but these were local conflicts that didn't directly involve India. And the spread of Islam was also relatively peaceful in Indonesia. So we haven't actually had a history of outsiders coming in and conquering by the sword as much as through religion and persuasion.
Yeah, my question is, why are some British apologists for the empire? Because I was reading Shashi Tharoor's book lately, and he mentions that approximately 58% of the British people think that their empire was benevolent for India. And in the same thing, the British are very fascinated with the Orient, say China or Japan. So why is this dichotomy? Is it because the British were around in India longer? So
the question, I think, is that why are there so many British people who are pro-empire? Is that the question? Yeah, so why is it that empire is so popular in Britain, and instead of sort of seeing it as a big crime against humanity, it's seen as something wonderful?
This is a very interesting question, because it's one I have to face as a historian on multiple occasions. As a British school child, I was taught nothing that you would consider to be about imperialism or colonialism. The British school system, certainly my school, concentrated exclusively on how great it was, basically. And I was hired by Oxford University Press to write the Australian high school textbook, the history textbook, and I wrote the chapters on India and China and Japan. And they said our guidelines are ecology and post-colonialism. You have to tell the story of empire from a post-colonial perspective. And so I found myself saying nothing positive at all about the empire, which my teachers at school would have absolutely hated. The very idea that I could describe the empire in what I'm sure to you is very familiar terms, but in England is completely unknown. I would blame that perspective on the way that the school system works, is that if you are studying history, is an elective, and most people stop studying history at about age 14, and what was then the O-level stage. And at the O-level stage, you just made it to 1760 when you stopped studying. And so it's only for those high school students who elect to study history that they stand any chance whatsoever of encountering the history of imperialism and the history of colonialism. But when I describe that, I'm describing the school system when I was a child, which is when dinosaurs ruled the earth. And I think now it's substantially different. Largely, I think, because there is a huge South Asian immigrant population in Britain, and so the curriculum has evolved to adapt to their personal experience. And so that has changed, and so there's much heavier emphasis now on imperialism, on colonialism, and also on hybridity, on the difference that immigrants, particularly South Asians and Caribbeans, have brought to the United Kingdom. Of course, now that the Brexit people are in charge, that's probably all going to change again. And it'll just be England's great and we don't care, which I think is probably the way it's going to change.
I'm getting the look from the MC. There is one more question. Do we have time? Very enthusiastic.
Yeah,
Last question.
I thought from my history teacher was in the audience, he was going to run out and punch me.
When we are saying Hinduism went to Southeast Asia, the term Hindu itself was not there. So when Hinduism went into Southeast Asia, the Japanese, the Indonesians, they did not say we have become Hindus. The gods were adopted in an organic way. The concept of Hinduism was not there in India itself. Hinduism is the term given by outsiders. Dharma is the more appropriate word.
It's a comment and fine. Yeah. Okay, we'll wrap it up. I think.